In the fall of 1944, the Americans were on the offensive against the Japanese in the Pacific. In 1942, General MacArthur had been forced to leave the Philippines when the Japanese had invaded those islands and then eventually had defeated the Americans and their Filipino allies. But upon leaving, MacArthur had vowed that one day he would return. The largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, ensured that General MacArthur would be able to keep his promise. The Japanese were determined to hold on to the Philippines because of geography. The Japanese home islands are north of the Philippines, and the oil supply of the Dutch East Indies, or the Japanese East Indies, was south of the Philippines. And so if the Philippines fell to the Americans, the Japanese would be cut off from their oil supplies. Consequently, the entire Japanese fleet was brought to bear on the Americans at Leyte Gulf. And this battle featured every kind of naval warfare and something totally new. For the Japanese began sending their inexperienced teenage pilots to certain death by the use of the kamikaze. The kamikaze was an aircraft to which was strapped a large bomb, and then the aircraft was guided into an American ship by one of these generally teenage suicide pilots. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was a very close call, but in the end, the Americans, now with vastly superior numbers in ships and technology, were victorious. General MacArthur kept his promise, returned to the Philippines, and liberated the Filipino people in the fall of 1944. And then after the war, and this is an important point, the Americans also kept their promise, for in 1934, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the American people had promised the Philippines their independence in 10 years. So if nothing had changed, in 1944, the Philippines would have been granted independence. Of course, there was a dramatic change. The Japanese invaded the Philippines. They had to be kicked out. But once that was accomplished, the Americans did indeed keep their promise, and the Philippines were granted independence in 1946. The fall of the Philippines was huge, but there were two more important steps to take before the Japanese home islands could be invaded. Those two steps were the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima was just one of those small, insignificant specks of sand in the vast Pacific Ocean that most Americans before the war had never heard of, and for 2 or 3 generations after the war would never forget. Iwo Jima was thought to be an essential, or at least very useful base for the giant American bombers, the B-29s, who took off from Saipan, which was south of Iwo Jima, on raids intending to bomb the Japanese home islands, which were north of Iwo Jima. And so Iwo Jima was to be used primarily as a secure, essentially an aircraft carrier that could take B-29s, a place where wounded B-29s, crippled B-29s could land if they couldn't make it all the way back to Saipan. The Japanese on Iwo Jima, again, fought desperately. It took 6 weeks to secure this tiny little island. 6 weeks and 7,000 dead Marines. The cost of the war seemed to be getting out of hand with every campaign. By the spring of 1945, Japan realized that it could not win the war. But they were not ready to surrender because the Japanese leadership still hoped to convince the Americans to accept a negotiated peace instead of the unconditional surrender that Franklin Roosevelt had announced at Casablanca. Could a negotiated peace leave the Japanese military dictatorship in place? Could it then somehow survive and rise again sometime in the future to cause still more trouble? That was their hope, a negotiated peace that would leave the military dictatorship in place. But the American position did not change. There would be no negotiated peace, only unconditional surrender. The Japanese plan, though, was for Okinawa to be such a bloodletting that it would force the Americans to give up on their planned invasion of Japan and accept the negotiated peace. The island of Okinawa is located about 400 miles from Japan. The United States hoped to use this large island, no longer a small volcanic ash speck of in the Pacific Ocean, but a large and well-cultivated island. The United States hoped to use Okinawa as a staging base for the invasion of Japan. The fight for the Big Island began on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945. And at that time, the United States launched the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. It involved some 300,000 American soldiers. And this fight for Okinawa lasted over 2 months. Okinawa was defended by 140,000 of the emperor's dedicated soldiers, dedicated to defending Okinawa or die trying. And this they did. 8,000 American soldiers died in the taking of Okinawa, and amazingly, 5,000 American naval personnel were killed as well. But the Americans would not give up unconditional surrender. Why so many naval deaths? It was because here at Okinawa, the Japanese launched the massive use of the kamikaze. Hundreds and hundreds of Japanese planes then launching themselves at American ships, the desired targets. The bigger the ship, the more likely the target. 34 American ships were hit during the Battle of Okinawa by kamikazes. It caused the American people, it caused the American leadership to wonder how many American naval vessels would go down in an invasion of Japan. How many sailors would lose their lives? Americans were afraid of the deadly answer. Japan was saving 10,000 kamikazes for that fateful day. 10,000. The end of the war. The invasion of the Japanese home islands was thought to be a nasty piece of work. The devotion of the Japanese to their homeland was clear in the tenacity of their fighting all across the Pacific. The Americans then did not look forward to this invasion. Then in April 1945, the leader of the American war effort, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, died of a brain hemorrhage. The nation was stunned. The majority of American soldiers and sailors could not remember a time when Franklin Roosevelt was not president of the United States. He'd been president for 13 years, and many of them were only 20, 21, 22 years old. What now? Who will lead us? Will the vice president have the sure hand that Franklin Roosevelt had demonstrated throughout the long, horrible war? Adolf Hitler thought not. He was not yet dead when Roosevelt passed away. Hitler rejoiced at the news that Roosevelt was dead. The Japanese also took heart. Roosevelt is dead. The new president was Harry Truman, who, as I said before, was not Roosevelt's vice president before the election of 1944. He was an American senator. He wasn't particularly well-versed in foreign policy, and Roosevelt had not kept him well informed as to the developments between himself and other nations like the Soviet Union, Great Britain, etc. In July, after having been president for only about 3 months, Truman, of course, went to Potsdam, Germany, to engage in the last wartime conference. And it was there in Potsdam that he was told that the American Manhattan Project, the project to develop the atomic bomb, had been successful. A bomb had been detonated in the American west of New Mexico. And so the bomb is ready to use. Truman discussed the use of the bomb with his advisors, and some of the scientists who had been involved in the building of the bomb suggested to Truman that its use now was immoral, since Germany was by this time out of the war, and the intent was always that it be dropped on Germany. For Truman, however, nothing seemed more immoral than asking men who had not started the war to die in an invasion of Japan instead of using the bomb. In addition, the best military estimates of the casualties of an American invasion of Japan itself, 500,000 men. 500,000. And what would the Japanese casualties be? Well into the millions. Well into the millions. Thus, in late July, Truman, remembering the losses on Okinawa, remembering the dead on Iwo Jima, remembering how the Japanese had fought at Saipan, he warned the Japanese that failure to surrender forthwith would result, and I quote, in their prompt and utter destruction. He did not elaborate, and he would suffer criticism in the future from historians who suggest that he should have been more specific. Though many Japanese wanted to surrender, the military officers who ran the country considered surrender dishonorable. They would not surrender. Just as their soldiers in the field would not surrender, the Japanese military leadership back home would not surrender. Moreover, had they surrendered, the cultural pressure on them, the military tradition, was then to commit suicide. What motivation then for a Japanese high-ranking officer to surrender? Death is death. It seemed better to fight rather than to commit suicide. And so, on August 6, 1945, a single B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 100,000 people died almost instantly. And over the next number of years, radiation sickness would take more. And then an equally important event. On August 8th, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. This is just 2 days after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And it was in this time the Japanese were thinking that if they did have to surrender, perhaps the Soviet Union would be the vehicle by which they would make that known to the Americans. They completely misunderstood, misread the situation. Joseph Stalin clarified the situation for the Japanese leadership on August 8th and declared war on Japan. You will recall, I hope, that Stalin had made this promise to FDR at Yalta. It was the only promise that Stalin kept. Then the day after the Soviet declaration of war, on August 9th, after waiting 3 days for some sign of surrender, the United States dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Still another 3 days passed before Japan called for a ceasefire. And so the Second World War was over. We now know that it took both atomic bombs and the Soviet declaration of war, 3 blows in succession in those early days of August. August 6th, August 8th, August 9th, to convince the Japanese to give up, to convince Emperor Hirohito to surrender. And when it became known that Emperor Hirohito intended to announce surrender, Japanese military officers tried to attack the palace. They did, in fact, attack the palace. They tried to get to Hirohito to stop him from telling the Japanese people to bear the unbearable. And so there was fighting over this surrender announcement in Japan. World War II in the Pacific ended on September 2nd. September 2nd, 1945, when the Japanese government surrendered to the United States. The ceremony was held in Tokyo Bay on board the great American battleship Missouri. In summary, the American victory in the Pacific War answered the question: whose vision would provide the structure for the Pacific world in the foreseeable future? Would it be the Japanese vision for empire and mastery over the region, or the American vision of the open door and freedom? It is true that the post-war world was not as peaceful, democratic, and egalitarian as the Americans hoped it to be. But historians, even American historians, have too often neglected a careful telling of the American achievement in winning the Second World War. Led by Americans, that accomplishment was unprecedented. Indeed, it was breathtaking. Historian Gaddis Smith well remembered. Hitler was dead, and Germany lay powerless under Allied occupation. The Japanese emperor's decision to surrender meant that the landings on Japan would be bloodless. Italy had withdrawn from the war and was about to acquire a respected place among nations. Americans, virtually unaided, had beaten Japan in the Pacific while providing the leadership and more than half of the men for the attack on Hitler from the West. At the same time, Americans had armed Britain, Russia, and China, and forces from nations like Poland and France. Their diplomacy had preserved the Great Coalition, established the United Nations, and laid the foundation for peace in Europe and Asia. Further results of the war include the American decision to move away from unilateralism and isolationism toward internationalism and to give the leading voice to basic human rights of freedom, peace, and international cooperation that remain compelling to this day. Indeed, it seemed to most Americans that their country might serve as the Good Samaritan of the entire world. To that end, the United States took the lead in founding the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the World Bank. Franklin Delano Roosevelt alone, among the Allied leaders, had a world point of view. We would term it a global point of view today, as opposed to a strictly nationalistic agenda. Roosevelt believed in a world that would willingly follow American values of freedom and democracy if given a fair opportunity. Thus, the American leader sought to provide the people of the world a middle way between the totalitarianism of the right, fascism, Nazism, and the totalitarianism of the left, communism. American goals in the war surpassed the defeat of the Axis powers and encompassed the ending of traditional colonialism. Indeed, if the Americans had their way, the mercantile walls of empire would fall to the sound of American trumpets, and there would be no need for an open door, as there would be no imperial wall to hang it on. Americans believe the lessons of the Great Depression and the subsequent World War was that empires and tariffs had been important factors in the coming of the conflict. And so Americans envisioned a world in which freedom of trade, freedom of the seas, freedom from war, upheld through the United Nations, would be a blessing to all people. Sadly, that vision has not been fully realized. But freedom and peace-loving nations of the world still hold it as their highest aspiration. So we don't know exactly how we're going to proceed after spring break. It could be that I'll be giving the lectures here in this lecture room and then posting them shortly after for all of you to see, just as we're going to do today. But it may also be for efficiency and convenience that we move this lecture to the studio. So if the background changes or the essence of the lecture seems a little bit different, then that's because we've moved it. I will send further instructions, of course, by email to everybody. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you back in class at some point. Take care. God bless.